I'll just give it a few moments as people are joining. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Lishtina, and I am co-director of Alumni Relations for the Harvard Association for Law and Business. Thank you so much for joining us at today's 2021 HALB Symposium event. At our symposium this year, we welcome leaders in business and law to talk about the challenges brought by the past year, namely the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial inequities that plague our communities. In addition to reflections about their work this past year, we'll discuss how leaders in different industries can respond in charting the path forward. I am honored to introduce Doug Lankler and Professor Glenn Cohen, who we'll be hearing from about the COVID-19 vaccine and efforts to address inequities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, among other topics. To briefly introduce our guests, Doug Lankler heads Pfizer's legal department as Executive Vice President and General Counsel. Before becoming General Counsel, Mr. Lankler served as Pfizer's Chief Compliance and Risk Officer. In addition to his leadership of the legal team, Mr. Lankler is heavily involved in conversations around diversity and inclusion at Pfizer, including as an executive sponsor of Pfizer's Global Black Community. Prior to joining Pfizer, Mr. Lankler served as an Assistant United States Attorney with the United States Department of Justice and as an AUSA in the Southern District of New York. Mr. Lankler is a graduate of the State University of New York at Albany and holds a JD from Cornell Law School. Professor Glenn Cohen is the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law and a Deputy Dean at Harvard Law School. Professor Cohen is one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of bioethics and the law, as well as health law. His current projects relate to big data, health information technologies, mobile health, reproductive technology, research ethics, organ transplantation, rationing and law medicine, health policy, FDA law, translational medicine, and medical tourism. So very busy professor. He has published widely and across disciplines with works appearing in the Science, JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature Medicine, the American Journal of Bioethics, the Hastings Center Report, and the American Journal of Public Health, the leading law reviews, as well as op-eds in the New York Times and Washington Post. Prior to becoming a professor, he served as a law clerk to Judge Michael Bodin of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit and as a lawyer for the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Division Appellate Staff, where he handled litigation in the Courts of Appeals and in the U.S. Supreme Court. He holds a BA from the University of Toronto and a JD from Harvard Law School. So next, I'll turn it over to Professor Cohen to moderate a question and answer discussion. We will also be welcoming questions from the audience. Please submit those through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll address those after the moderated portion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and we're really honored to have you here, Mr. Lankler. You know, just to give people some context, right? When historians write about this century, probably maybe with the only exception of the Manhattan Project, has there been a more impressive scientific development. When you ask people what could have been done in a year's time, the idea that we have not just one, but multiple vaccines available really will be. So, you know, if Pfizer is the Michael Jordan of vaccine development, this is Michael Jordan's lawyer as a way of thinking about it, right? So we're very excited to have you. So we've tried to do justice, if you will, to your career path, Mr. Lankler, with a flyover summary, but I'd love if you could give a little bit more flavor in your own words of your path here. And in particular, I think this would be useful for some of the students who are thinking about where their path might take them.
Great. Well, first of all, it is such a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I greatly appreciate the invitation and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I will tell you that the most heartening thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but since you referenced it, about this whole process was the notion that the industry came together. And, you know, around a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, a group of people that is normally very, very competitive with each other decided to pool scientists and otherwise And to your point, the fact that we have multiple vaccines is just a great, great thing. Obviously, we're thrilled that we have a vaccine that's in there as well, and that's all terrific. I am somebody who genuinely always wanted to be a lawyer, as weird as that may sound. My dad was a career prosecutor. Excuse me, he was an assistant district attorney in the homicide bureau at the Manhattan DA's office. And he would come home at night and we'd have dinner together and as a family, and he would tell us about his day. And I genuinely listened to him and said, "You're Batman. This is great stuff." And you're putting bad guys in jail, but you're also trying to make sure good people don't suffer injustice. So that really, really appealed to me. And I went to college knowing I wanted to go to law school, and I went to law school knowing I wanted to be a prosecutor. It got more complicated after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office because I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I genuinely say this to kind of give people comfort. I then engaged in probably what was one of the most negligent job searches of anybody. And a friend of mine, and I went around to a few different companies. I didn't think I wanted to go back to a law firm. I really enjoyed my time at Simpson Thacher. I thought it was a great firm, a lot of good people, and I learned a lot, obviously. Law firms, I think, do an incredible job of teaching you how to be a good lawyer. No offense to law schools, they obviously do that too. But law firms are really very well equipped to throw you in there and get you going, which is great. And I knew I didn't want to go back to that. And a friend of mine from law school called me up and said he was at Warner Lambert, which I'd never heard of before. He loved his job. The people were great. He enjoyed the industry, and I should come out. So I went out for an interview, and I liked the people. And I got home and I told my wife, "Man, I really like the people. They were really, really impressive there. And I like the mission. And I like this notion of, trying to help patients and drive healthcare. That was really appealing to me." My wife then asked me like 20 questions that I didn't ask her in the interview, like, how's the company doing? What are its financial prospects? All these things. And by the end of which I was kind of like, "You should come to the next interview, honey, because you have good questions to ask and whatnot." But it worked out. And about a year after I joined Warner Lambert, Pfizer acquired Warner Lambert, and I've now been with the company for 22 years, and I can tell you I've really enjoyed it. If you said to me back in law school that I'm going to end up being a pharmaceutical lawyer, I might have had a panic attack, genuinely thinking like, I don't know how that could possibly be fun or good or anything like that. But it's really been something that I've enjoyed a lot.
Fantastic. So we'll talk about what this last year has been like, this exceptional year in all of our lives. Before we get there, I want to hear a little bit about what it's like to be the general counsel of Pfizer in a normal year, if ever there is a normal year, and the kinds of more common legal and compliance issues you deal with on a day-to-day basis when it's not COVID all the time.
Yeah, no, this is a great job. Pfizer obviously is a large company. It's a multinational company. It's a very highly regulated company. It has challenges. It has not always been perfect. If you look at our history, like a lot of other pharmaceutical companies and a lot of other large companies, we've hit bumps along the way. Fortunately, knock on wood, the last many years have been a lot smoother. But all those things are good for lawyers, right? And make the job very, very interesting. I obviously manage litigation, and I manage governance and the dealings with the board. I'm a member of our management team, so I get to see and am exposed to really all of the major things that the company is engaged with and doing, and genuinely benefit from getting to work at a place that well before I got there always really appreciated and valued the roles of the legal division and the compliance people. It is a place that I think has a compass that points due north. We're humans, we're not perfect, as I referred to before, but I think when me and my team get involved, we're not typically engaged as much in gee, that's too risky, you shouldn't be getting involved in that. It tends to be more, given the complexities of the laws and regulations, especially internationally, with which we deal, how do we navigate that so that we can get to an outcome that's going to be good for patients? Because that's the ultimate goal.
Great. So now I want to shift to a little bit of COVID life, right? And so can you walk us through a little bit? I mean, we're here at this great endpoint, right? But from the beginning of the pandemic, what your job as general counsel, how it interfaced with, in particular, the vaccine development, your involvement with FDA, how different it was from other kinds of times when you're doing a product launch or developing a product and going through clinical trials. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about how the last year has been as a general counsel.
Absolutely. I'm going to forewarn you that I'm going to be kind of gushing a bit about my boss, which a lot of smart general counsels do, and a lot of other smart executives do. But this is genuinely a moment. Just I can say as maybe as a grandson of a minister, with trying to bolster my credibility as much as I can, where the leader just played a phenomenally important role. And so, I think it was March 16th, that Monday that things like a lot of us remember. It was the first time in a long time none of us were in the office. Albert Bourla, our CEO, called us together as a management team and kind of set the tone. First of all, said he thought we were in for a long and difficult and trying time. Fully expected that the company would ensure the safety of its colleagues and continue the important production and delivery of necessary hospital products and other things that Pfizer makes and has been making for a long time, and that Pfizer would play a role in helping to solve what was obviously a pretty scary and significant crisis. And he said, whether that means we invent something, we partner with somebody who invents something, we help somebody manufacture something. He literally referenced something along the lines of get coffee for the people who are, doing something. His notion was we were going to dive in. And as I referenced before, I think one of the things that he frequently said, which I really just kind of personally appreciated, was this notion that everybody was going to be diving in and he was going to be talking to all the other CEOs to make sure we were all coordinating and working together. I think he felt like, and reiterated over and over again, this is the job of the pharmaceutical industry. This is what we're supposed to do. This is understandably what society should count on us to do. And we should deliver solutions in this regard. And those solutions should be safe, and they should be effective. They should be accessible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the license all of you give us to do what we do, right? You give us patents and you give us monopolies, and you give us your trust when you ingest a pill. So this was the industry's moment. And I think the fact that Albert was of the mind that we had to seize that moment and move forward and get going on it was a big deal. He was, with me in particular, clearly expecting that we would make sure that along the way, we would do it the right way. And one of the things that I think a lot of you can all appreciate, that I've reiterated to him over and over again, which is this notion, and I appreciate that he appreciates this idea, that while things might be understood in the moment as we were working through a pandemic, when those issues really come to fore and we have to deal with them, which will be 3 years from now, 5 years from now, a lot of people are going to forget the dynamics that were at play. So there are no excuses. We can't say, well, we had to move fast. We can't say, well, gee, we needed to cut that corner because, there was a pandemic and whatnot. We really had to make sure that we'd be able to defend anything and everything that we did as if times were normal. And I think that's always been something he and the other members of the team have appreciated, which make my job a little bit more manageable. The only other thing I would say is, I think during normal times, I literally would learn something new every day. in this role. And it's one of the fascinating things about being a lawyer. It's one of the, at least for me, sometimes less comfortable things about being a lawyer. I don't like it when people call me up and ask a question and I have to say, I really don't know the answer to that. And they'd be like, gee, haven't you been here for a while? Haven't you been doing this job for a while? How do you not know the answer? But the reality is that's going to happen a lot to all of us as lawyers, no matter how experienced you are. Man, when this all happened, it was like every hour I was learning something new. And the only thing that would come to my aid in this regard is I have a very, very good team. They're very, very, I think they're world class. And I relied on that team. And we have good outside lawyers too. And my sense always was like, I don't really have a good excuse for giving the wrong answer. We should take the time we need to take, figure out what the right answer is, lean on the right people, and culminate, the brilliance that surrounds me and makes me look good all the time to make sure that we give the right answer, regardless of the dynamics that are at play now.
So I want to follow up on that bit about your team, and I'm going to ask, this might be a slightly careerist question for the benefit of the students, that when you think who you want on your team and who's excelling on your team, are there any common characteristics that they have? I mean, we're going to take smarts for granted, right? That's in some ways, you obviously want people who are intelligent, but that's not enough to thrive in these kinds of roles. What do you look for when you build your team?
Yeah, I would say, kind of my favorite thing, and I'm with you. I think, look, it's table stakes to be smart, right? It's table stakes to work hard, do your homework, show up prepared, all those things. But I'm a very big fan of EQ. I have found that in the corporate dynamic, you got to interact with everybody, and that's the manufacturing guy who's difficult and prickly. I'm not my manufacturing guy; he's a wonderful person, but I'm just making this up. Obviously, the sales lead who can be challenging. The head of HR who wants a little bit more of a conversation and whatnot. So that notion of being able to read a room is important. And then obviously the other thing is judgment, which builds and grows over time. But you want people who are going to sit there and say, this doesn't smell right to me. If along the way things are progressing. Trains have a way of leaving stations at big organizations and then starting to roll down tracks very, very quickly. And having people who are willing to sit there and say, hey, I can tell that there's a lot of excitement and buildup around this. I don't know, have we thought of this and have we thought of that? Those are really important kind of skills to be able to bring to bear. And then, communicating, right? All of us have got to really be able to concisely, which you can probably already tell, not always so good at, get across the notions that the business needs to understand.
I'm a law professor, so in my view, you've been very succinct by comparison to most of what I hear. So I think you're doing a good job in that. I want to shift a little bit to ask you about politics. And here's what I'll say is that, the last administration had a very interesting relationship with pharma at different moments, but certainly in the last year, let's say, I mean, Pfizer and the name Pfizer was an important part of the political campaign and the jousting. Every American kind of knew the name of the company and looked day to day at kind of what was being said about you. So that's a level of scrutiny that's pretty unprecedented and entanglement with politics. Both when you reflect on how you and your team handled it from your perch of the GC, but also in thinking about giving advice to other councils about, I don't know, there'll ever be something quite so similar, but comparable in some ways sort of events in terms of public and political entanglement. Any reflections that you can share on that?
Yeah, no, I this is another area where I'll brag a bit about the boss. So fortunately, before I even had a chance to express an opinion about what to do in this regard, Albert was of the mindset that we were going to kind of avoid this at all costs. We were just not going to get pulled into the political dynamic. Now, in some ways that can be easier said than done, but he did some things that were smart. People may not remember now, but back in the summer when this started to pick up, we and the other pharmaceutical players who were involved in vaccines all engaged in a pledge where we said, we're just not going to let politics sway us in any way. That was Albert's idea. By the way, talk about the kind of thing that makes a lawyer nervous. When he called me up and said, I have this idea, we'll make a pledge. I was like, hey, like, what are you going to pledge? How are we going to enforce it? All this other stuff. But it really worked out well. And it was a kind of a message to the government as a whole, whether it be to the White House, FDA, whoever it was. Look, guys, this is the way we have to play this. If you try to pull us into this, that's not going to be good for anybody. And then the other thing that he did was he very early on stated in a letter that he sent out to colleagues that we were going to be driven by the speed of science, not by the speed of an election or anything else. We're going to go as fast as science lets us go, with the outcome of a safe and effective vaccine at the end of it. And sometimes that means you get to go fast, and sometimes that means you get to go slow. One of the big issues was this notion of, when are you guys going to announce whether you have a working vaccine or not? And the beauty of all of that was you had to wait for the science. You had to wait for enough people in your study, unfortunately, to get COVID. And so that's completely out of our control. And we had a data safety monitoring board that could see the numbers. And once we hit a point where we knew that there was enough numbers and it made sense to sit and listen to the outcome of where we were and where the data was, we did that immediately. And everybody kind of looked at it and said, well, geez, it's, in this relation to the election. I mean, to me, it almost proved that had to be the case, because we would have either done it way before or way after. You're not going to let yourself get drawn into something that you can control if you can control it. We couldn't control that. That's the way it worked. And Albert would take his share of calls from the White House, FDA, others. By the way, for what it's worth, just so people know, FDA was amazing throughout this process. I think, I don't think the people I was around, I've certainly never had a year where I worked harder. And I think everybody loved every minute of that work. FDA was working hard. Those folks were in all the time as well, and really trying to do everything they could to make sure that they did what they were supposed to do, which was ensure a safe and efficacious medicine at the end. And there was a lot of players in the government that worked hard and were very, very helpful. I think Albert's ability to interact with the politicians and other leaders he had to interact with, not just in the US, but globally, in a way that drove home this constant message of, look, we're going as fast as we can. We're going to operate at the speed of science. That's what you need. That's what we need. If we do anything otherwise, the ultimate confidence in the end product won't be there. So then that doesn't do anybody any good. And I think enough people kind of heard that message that we were able to stay out of the fray, at least from our experience and standpoint.
Great. So you mentioned the global, and now I want to zone in on that. So again, this has been an amazing success story. We are soon going to be at a place in the United States where we will have more doses than arms that want to be volunteered for doses, right? That is, God willing, a triumph. But the situation looks very different elsewhere in the world. Many countries haven't had a single vaccination yet. This is a difficult position to be in as a company, right? And I'm curious if you can tell us a little about the ways in which Pfizer balances demands on profits, corporate social responsibility, global justice, and also what you might say to your critics in this regard.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think this is a really important area. So when Albert started in the role, as a lot of leaders do, he kind of set his values out. We have 4, I think, relatively interesting values. We have courage and excellence, which just about everybody has. We have equity, which is one we really struggled with, because you never want to set a value that you don't think you're going to be able to clobber right out of the gate. And we knew that the challenges of equity in society, throughout the industry, et cetera, are ones that are real. And we also have joy. And the idea is that unless you're really enjoying what you do, you're not going to bring your full self to your job. that concept of equity has been literally something that the legal team discusses all the time, because we're trying to find this right balance between how do you get a vaccine that requires extensive refrigeration into a place that you might even have difficulty getting water into, and how are you going to make sure that it gets there, it's properly used, people don't steal it or try to do something improper with it, it's properly administered, et cetera, et cetera. That means we've got to engage significantly as a company. And obviously, we can't be everywhere at once and all those things. So we started very early on working with WHO, working with UNICEF, working with COVAX, working with PAHO, the Gates Foundation, a lot of different groups to brainstorm around how we could do this in an effective way. Albert said clearly early on, he wants the Pfizer vaccine all around the world. And he drove that, and he reminded the team equity is one of our values. So that's really been a big principle of it. And the lawyers that work in this area genuinely just work day and night, because we get new countries that are added to lists, and they say, we want to get the vaccine to this country, and we got to figure out, is it possible? Does it work? Does it work logistically, practically? Does it work legally? If we ask for something like indemnification, if the vaccine isn't kept at the proper temperature and then is misadministered, can that country even give us indemnification? Are they even legally set up for it? If there are damages, who pays and how does it work? And you obviously want to find this balance, because you don't want a dynamic where the world sits there and says, why are Pfizer's lawyers so worried about their vaccine? And yet at the same time, you have a fiduciary obligation to your shareholders, to other significant stakeholders, to patients, not to just play willy-nilly with the company's reputation or its assets or its abilities. So there's always been that difficult balance. I'm thrilled that this is working. We're getting vaccines on the ground to difficult places. There's already been 17 or 18 very difficult countries that have made the list, and vaccines have landed on the ground in on the African continent, and parts of Latin and South America and other areas that are challenging. But this is going to be something that we're going to have to keep working at all the time. And the directive from the boss and the board is very clear: get it done. So we're going to have to continue to make these judgment calls about how much risk we think it's okay to tell the client, okay, go ahead and do it, because it is not without risk. There's significant risk. And we can't just say to them, well, it's risky, but you guys decide. We have to tell them, do it or don't do it. And that's really what they're looking for from us. And when you've got that idea of, yeah, but there's people there that haven't gotten a vaccine, you want to figure out a way to get to yes. That's the goal.
Great. So I'm going to ask you about a different kind of equity, which is within the United States here. We know the pandemic has had a disparate impact on communities of color, but more generally, you have some great initiatives that you've been part of. You're the executive sponsor of Pfizer's Global Black Community. You've also been a participant in the Leadership Summit for Women in Law that was held in 2019. Can you say a little bit both on the Pfizer level, but also on the General Counsel's office level, what y'all are doing regarding inequities within our communities, both legal and national?
Yeah, so being involved with the GBC, especially throughout the events of last year, and obviously there's a pretty important trial going on that I'm sure everybody is paying close attention to. For me, it's just been very, very good. It's been a healthy thing for me as just obviously a white male to be constantly surrounded and focused on issues that don't always impact me as personally and directly as they do others. And working for a CEO who's a Greek Jew whose parents survived the Holocaust also adds this element of a leadership that understands the really critical aspects of equity. And our own Black and African American colleagues said there's things at Pfizer that we've all been trying to change for a while, that we should really dedicate focus to and work on it. And that's been happening, especially since Albert got into the role, given his focus on equity. And that really kind of helped, candidly, as we were driving through the summer, because it forced us to think about how do we make sure that if we're running clinical studies, especially given concerns about the medical world's interaction with the African-American community in the past, and the difficult history that's there, we got to make sure that our studies are diverse, because it's not going to do anybody any good unless we can ultimately demonstrate that we had good, diverse studies. We were able to do that, and that was as a result of significant efforts from a recruiting standpoint, and really putting a significant emphasis on that. And then our commercial team has been driving, since we thought that we might be able to play a role in this, on the concept of education. So, and we're big fans of the notion of local. We try to be very local. We try to get into the communities that are there, leverage what's going on, and try to assist to drive the notion of education, that you know, all of the different communities, including those that are underrepresented, you know, pay attention to the critical nature of this vaccine, and you know, give it a chance. And while at the same time still acknowledging the past mistakes, because they're not insignificant and they're not going to just go away, and we're going to suddenly have trust all around the world. But we are finding that the uptake in those respects has been successful, fortunately.
Great. So I've got just one more question, and I'll turn it over to Jessica for the audience Q&A. And that's, you know, you've got some wind in your sails right now. You have a lot of very positive feelings towards the company. It's a moment for leadership. Of course, always leadership in an industry, there's lots of antitrust concerns about what it means to lead versus to collude, of course. Putting that aside, if you had the opportunity to lead from your perch the rest of the industry, what are the big opportunities that you think are ahead of you for the next couple of years in terms of questions about equity, in terms of questions of justice, or just what you'd like to see and where you'd like to see the industry going? So what should, as a leader in the field, what do you hope to see?
Yeah, look, it's a phrase that's often repeated, but that is nonetheless important. You know, this idea that reputation is gained in drops and lost in buckets. You know, we are very, very always acutely aware of that. And I like that the day we found out that the vaccine worked, Albert said, okay, now the real work begins. Now's where it gets hard, because everything we do will be examined, and we really need to make sure that we do things right and kind of move forward on a perch that is good. Look, we were the first biopharmaceutical company to issue a sustainability bond of $1 billion plus, proceeds of which are earmarked for environmental and social initiatives. You know, we have our own parity goals. We have goals that really focus on diversity, because internally at Pfizer, that's a really important notion. And we try to make sure that we also use this kind of perch to make sure that people understand that innovation is what got us here. You know, we didn't take money from the government. We eventually sold vaccine to the government and got money in exchange for the vaccine. But in the beginning, when the U.S. government was, you know, handing out a lot of money to a lot of companies, including very large companies that have a lot of money, we said, look, we know we're going to be able to move faster if we don't take the money. It's more risky. If this ends up not working, that's $2 billion that's out the door, and that was a situation that we didn't take lightly. But we'll be able to move faster, so we're not going to take that money. Let's move forward. Let's have some confidence in our ability to innovate here. This is what we do. This is what we know how to do, and we do it pretty well. And let's move forward and make sure that we do it right. And you know, I with anything pharmaceutical, luck plays a massive role. Whether your compound works or doesn't work, always has you know, luck always has a big impact. So, you know, we don't take any of that for granted. And I would reiterate the notion that this has been humbling. It's been very, very humbling. And it reminds, I think, all of us, not just in Pfizer, but in other great companies that have produced fantastic solutions and been, you know, played a really important role in the pandemic, and by the way, not just in the pharmaceutical industry, that there are things that are just important, and we got to stay focused on those things and drive those things in a meaningful way. We try not to use our voice kind of on every social issue that comes up. We try to stay connected to the pharmaceutical industry and to healthcare, because we think that that's our sweet spot. That's where we have more of our expertise. But we do use that voice to try to make sure that our beliefs about social injustice, diversity, the environment, other things kind of come through, and we'll continue to do that.
Wonderful. Well, as I remind people, when FDA set out its policies as to what efficacy requirement it would have to approve the first vaccine, it said something like 50%, and you came in at an average effect of 95%, right? So luck definitely has something to do it, but you're also definitely doing something right in record time. So we're really glad to have you here. I'm going to turn it over now to Jessica, who's going to go to the audience question and answer.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so first question from the audience is, what are your thoughts on compulsory licensing, as has been raised by several developing countries? WHO's COVAX is doing a job in ensuring equity, but Big Pharma can play a role too. If not compulsory licensing, how about voluntary licensing, as seen with Gilead and Remdesivir?
Yeah, it's interesting in this area, because you could kind of come right out of the gate and say, it doesn't matter, we could give everybody the license. They can't make it, because making a vaccine like this is just incredibly difficult, requires a lot of expertise, significant equipment and the like. And it also requires the components, which are rare in this world now. We don't have capacity issues. Any issues with making enough vaccine for the world are always going to be driven by the components that are out there. And I think I read in the paper yesterday that Stanford scientists reverse engineered both ours and Moderna's vaccine and posted it online on GitHub, I think. So look, that kind of thing is going to happen. And I think what we like to try to stay focused on is there is always a path to getting access to medicines. We think we can play an important role in delivering on that path. And the best thing we've always thought is to engage. So if a given country says, we're going to engage in compulsory licensing, we're going to take your patent, we're going to take your product, and we're going to run with it, we like to engage, because we like to make sure that country understands that without intellectual property and ensuring that the sanctity of the intellectual property dynamic, you wouldn't have a vaccine now, just genuinely. There's no way we would have had the ability, the history, the knowledge, the expertise, or the money to get done what needed to get done to bring a vaccine to market within 9 months. And that's true of all the other players as well. We all rely on the sanctity of intellectual property. And if that gets watered down or whittled away at, when the next pandemic comes, it's going to be a problem. And it's going to be the type of thing that is difficult. And at least we've been able to successfully argue to countries that have raised the notion of compulsory licensing that there's a better way. And that just, by just simply stripping companies of their intellectual property and handing out the formula or licenses or whatnot won't solve the problem. You're going to end up with counterfeit medications. You're going to end up with medications out there that have different quality aspects. You're going to have component issues and compound issues that are going to come to fore as well. So usually, if we can engage, we're able to convince people that the compulsory way is not a good way to go.
All right. So related to other approaches, perhaps, does Pfizer interact with other countries in their vaccine development, such as China's Sinovac?
Yeah. So there's this video that Pfizer put out. It was an ad that came out early on. I actually have a link to it in my email signature now because I liked it so much. And it was "Science Will Win." And it talked about, it was obviously, back in March, back in April, there was a lot of despair and concern. And the goal of this ad was to kind of say there's hope. And that hope is in science. And my favorite line in this ad was, Pfizer's doing this, but so are other academic institutions and other companies. And I like the notion that we were driving the idea and hopefully people were gaining some hope from the idea that we were all in this. And that means countries too, and governments as well. And I don't think a day has passed. I can't imagine a day has passed since March where Albert wasn't on the phone with one, if not several, significant world leaders, or a leader of a country, big or small, kind of talking about like, how do we help and what do we do? And what are we going to do to help make sure that a vaccine, hopefully ours, maybe somebody else's, gets to that country as soon. There is a lot of that goes on. And obviously different countries operate differently. China operates differently, Russia operates differently. And there are different ways that we interact. But what I've always really loved and admired about society in this regard is everybody put their logo down and they came to the table. And the idea was, this is on us. This is what's expected of us. We've got to deliver. And fortunately, it looks like that's what happened.
Great. So related to the comment about science and your allusion to indemnification earlier, there's been a couple questions about deviations from the recommendation of a 21-day interval between doses. So curious on how Pfizer is dealing with this, whether those recommendations are coming from governments or private actors.
Yeah, this is another place. There's good and bad things about being very highly regulated, right? This is one of the great things about being very highly regulated. We make a product, we study the living daylights out of it as hard as we can. We get all of the data together in every single table format anybody could possibly want. We slice and dice all the information a million different ways, and we hand it off to experts. And we give it to governments and we say, here's what we found. This is why we think our product works. We think you should give our product approval. And governments are smart. They typically say, well, before we take your word for it, we're going to bring together an independent group of experts and we're going to have them go through it. And they pound through it, right? And at the end of the day, you either get a product or you don't get a product. But one of the things I like about it is when we get a product, the regulators, whether it's FDA or EMA or wherever you are, say, this is how your product is approved to be used. There's no other way your product is approved to be used. And we always tell people you should use the product in the way it's been approved to be used. We also always like to be driven by data. So, my grandma will ask me, is it okay if a lot of time passes between my first and second shot? My brother-in-law says, can I just get one shot? I heard you guys are 80% effective after one shot. What do I need a second shot for? And I always love telling people, you know what? I'm a lawyer. I'm not smart enough to answer these kind of questions. The people who are smart enough say no. The people who are smart enough say, this is the amount of time that should pass between your two doses, and you should get your second dose. Absolutely get your second dose. I got my second dose. I'm thrilled about it, and I just got it. And everybody in my family and anybody I've ever talked to, I've said, make sure you get 2 doses if you're getting a 2-dose vaccine, and try to follow the time spread and the timelines that we've set out, because we set them out for a reason. That's how we studied our product. We don't know whether it works or doesn't work in other contexts. And obviously science can be very specific in this regard.
So, okay, this is shifting gears a little bit maybe, but moving forward with developing a vaccine clearly worked within the interest of Pfizer, but how did you manage the risk on the downside? For instance, AstraZeneca's brand name and reputation has been tarnished with their work on the vaccine. How did Pfizer go about limiting such a risk?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we did was we we engaged as a team and with our board. So there was great clarity around what is the risk. And kind of to the point of your question, there's two big major measures. There's a dollar measure. We could sit there and say, if we spend all this money and we're manufacturing a vaccine that ultimately never goes in anybody's arms, how much money have we spent? And that was a lot. As I said, it was, in the neighborhood of $2 billion. And we weren't going to know until the end whether or not that was going to be the right investment. That's a lot of money. Losing $2 billion would not be a good thing. And mostly it's just not good for patients or science, because that's $2 million we don't have to put into oncology or heart disease or anything, any of the other areas that we're engaged in and that we study all the time and think are important to patients. The other big measure is reputation. So, and to me, look, again, whenever we talk about this, I'm always worried about what could happen. Somebody says something, somebody does something. We issue data or information, and for some reason, somebody thinks we weren't as fulsome as we should be. Knock on wood, that has not happened to us today. The other companies that are in play on all this stuff are good companies. They're smart. They've got experience with this stuff. So bad things can happen to good people. It just can. And, I think ultimately you've got to keep coming back to the notion that, it's important to us that we do it right, that we think about this very, very long term. We don't take shortcuts, and we keep kind of reminding ourselves of that, because again, we'll lose this in the buckets if we mess it up. And, it's hard to kind of seek forgiveness in this area, right? Because it's too important. So you're never going to be able to come up with a rationale as to why you did something wrong, if you did something wrong. So not purposefully doing something wrong is always the table stakes, and you never purposefully do anything wrong. The real focus is on trying to make sure you don't make mistakes, and human beings make mistakes. It happens. So knock on wood, so far so good. It's working well. We've got 160 million doses, I think, out around the world. We're delivering at 99.9% quality, and as against our own standards. And we announced this morning that it looks like we're 100% effective in 12 to 15-year-olds. We're spending a lot of time now trying to make sure the product is safe and effective in infants and people under the age of 12, because that's an important population. We do it the right way. We go slow. We rely on the experts. We make sure that science drives everything that we do. And it's nice to be a lawyer in that dynamic, because the lawyer always plays a significant role. So I think you all picked the right area to be in.
Great. Just quickly on vaccine efficacy, there is a question about whether Pfizer has been studying the vaccine's efficacy against new variants.
Yes, we have been. And, hopefully data will come out on that soon. So I can't really talk about it other than to say we watch that carefully. One little bit of kind of, early indicator is in Israel, where almost everybody has gotten the Pfizer vaccine. It's actually a really interesting country because of its borders, because of its kind of history of managing crises. Almost every citizen of Israel has their own digital medical record, so they can really track things very closely. It's been very successful, and the UK variant plays a significant role in Israel. So it looks like, from a real world standpoint, that our vaccine is effective, at least against the UK variant. And we continue to watch and study the other variants to see whether we'll need to leverage that aspect of mRNA, which allows, we think, for tweaking of the vaccine as needed to address variants. And I think the other thing that everybody always wants to know is, like, is this going to be like the measles, where I get this once and I'm done for life? Or is this going to be like the flu, where I have to get it every year? And boy, is it really going to be like the flu, or are we going to know it works, or is some of the times it's going to work, some of the time it doesn't work? And the response to that is we don't know. We just don't know yet. And I know that's frustrating. This is what happens when a vaccine comes out this quickly, and you are literally dealing with it real time. But the good thing is we've got data. We're culminating that data. We're tracking that data. We're working closely with regulators to make sure that that data is interpreted properly and then represented properly, so that we can eventually tell people, here's what we know. You do need a booster. You don't need a booster. You need something totally different. Whatever it is, we'll be able to tell people. And hopefully, I at least have a lot of confidence that the industry will be able to generate solutions for whatever ends up getting needed. Hopefully, Pfizer is at the forefront of that, but whether it is or isn't, I guess I've just developed a fair amount of admiration for the industry as a whole. Look at Moderna. This is the first product they ever made. Phenomenal. It's really, really impressive. And or J&J or anybody, I think that there's been a demonstration that there's real power in innovation. It can really bring about genuine solutions.
Great. So in contrast with Israel, perhaps other countries, including Canada, for example, have perhaps been less prepared for the pandemic, with Canada struggling to secure Pfizer doses. What thoughts do you have on how countries could be better prepared in the future?
Yeah, I think as a globe, as a planet, we all have to start thinking about pandemics very differently. Who wants to do that, right? No one. If times are good and a bunch of consultants walk into your office and say, hey, look, we want to talk to you about pandemic preparedness, you just want to say, why do we want to think about that? Let's think about something else. We collectively as a planet need to think differently about future pandemics, because they're going to happen, right? And how quickly or how soon or how many times, nobody knows, but they've happened before, and it's hard to say that they're not going to happen again. And at least one of the things that we learned was, once we had the vaccine and we started talking to nations about, and this is before we knew it worked, this is in the summer now, about, how much would you want, and what do you want to buy, and how much can we sell, and how much can we get to you? I don't know that there was as much kind of aggressiveness on anybody's part to kind of dive in and go forward. And that could be for good reason. How do I know yours is going to work? There's several others that are out in the market. Maybe I should spread my bets. Maybe I should do something differently. And I don't know what the answer to that is. But the reality is that what we did was we took calls. And if somebody said, country X, and we want to buy this amount of your vaccine or talk to you about how we can do it, we don't charge a lot of money for this vaccine. This is not a money-making operation, and it's probably what I think like a tenth of what a typical vaccine, might cost. So, there's got to be some thinking about how collectively together we handle pandemics, because the other thing that's very clear is that until the whole world gets cleared up of this, it's going to be a whole world problem. So we may solve this problem in New York and Boston and the US, and maybe even in Canada, but if it's still bouncing all around Europe or South America, that's a problem, because it's going to continue to spread. So our hope is to get our vaccine mass produced at extensive qualities, so that supply way outpaces demand, and that anybody and everybody who wants a vaccine can get it, and hopefully a vaccine that works, safe, effective, and if it has to be adjusted, it gets adjusted. If it doesn't have to be adjusted, great. But that's what we ultimately want. And if Pfizer delivers that, obviously we're thrilled. But if another company is a player, that's a great thing, because choices are always good to have. It means you're spreading out the obligation and need to produce. If we have a manufacturing problem, there's other companies that can step in. vice versa, et cetera, et cetera. It's good to have, multiple players in, and we've always wanted and are glad that there are other successes as well.
Great. Okay, so mindful of the time, I think this will be the last question. So as a lawyer in this process, how have you thought about risk in terms of the development timeline, as well as in terms of combating anti-vaccine skepticism?
Yeah, fantastic question. I genuinely think like this is the hardest thing about being a lawyer, right? Because you hear some people talk, maybe a scientist says something, a marketer says something, a manufacturing guy says something, and it's your job to kind of take it all in and issue spot, right? We all think about that concept a lot. And, where is risk popping up? And is that risk big? And should I say something, or should I stop this conversation, or should I tell everybody, whoa, put your pens down because we got to stop taking notes for a second, because we're all jumping around in a lot of different concepts, and those notes are going to end up getting misinterpreted down the road. What you want to do is kind of listen carefully and ask the right questions, and say to your scientist, well, does that make you nervous? Say to your manufacturer, are we going to be able to make it that quickly? Are you nervous? What's happening, because they're experts and they can help you kind of drive and put your risk meter at the right place on the spectrum as you go. But I think an important thing that I hope we didn't do, which I don't think we did, but I hope history plays out that we didn't do this, is we never said, boy, well, it's a pandemic, we just got to do it. We just didn't do that. We simply said we should move as quickly as we can, but we shouldn't move any more quickly than we should. And that was always a key aspect of this. And look, it wasn't hard for me to remind people in the room that if we get this right, this is going to be a product that goes to a lot of people very quickly. A lot of people very quickly. So if there's something wrong, that's not going to be good. And that was always a very simple way to kind of ground everybody in the same thing I was worried about, right? Like, that's easy to think about. And look, I watch the news every night, and I see the lines of cars, and I see the people rolling down their windows and lifting up their sleeves. And I'm always thrilled when I hear, the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine was given out at this site or whatever. That's great. But as a lawyer, I sit there and I say, I'm glad we did it the right way along the way, because that gives me more comfort that that person who just had our product shot into their body, and that our product is now going to move around their body, is safe, and that product is going to effectively help protect them against getting COVID and having some of the issues that come along with COVID. So that's always been the hope, and like I said, hopefully history plays out that that's what we did, and that we did it right all along the way.
For sure. Well, on behalf of the Harvard Association for Law and Business, as well as our audience, I want to extend a huge thank you to Doug Lankler and Professor Glenn Cohen for joining us today, and for this very insightful and thoughtful conversation. We hope that we'll be able to continue our conversation tomorrow with Jeremiah Gordon in talking about Google's efforts to invest $100 million in Black-led startups and investment firms. Until then, I wish everyone good health and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Mr. Lankler.
My great pleasure. Thanks so much. Thank you, Professor. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care.